Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk a bit about what logic is, what we're going to be talking about in this class. And a lot of times when I have students, they have preconceptions about exactly what logic is. They've watched a little too much Star Trek maybe, and they think, well, logic is what Mr. Spock does. It's emotionless, it's cold, rationality. And that makes some contact with the truth, but it's not really what we're going to do. If you expect this class to make you into Mr. Spock or like some sort of mental genius, sorry to disappoint, that's not going to happen, right? Logic is useful, and I hope you will see this, and it does help us to think more clearly. But we need to talk about exactly what logic is, to get clear on that, before we can see how it does that and what we're going to be doing in this course. So the simplest way I can think of to explain what logic is about and what we'll be doing in this course is to say that logic focuses on evaluating the structure of arguments. One thing you might hear about logic is it's about evaluating arguments. Are they good arguments? Are they bad arguments? And there's actually two parts to this, and logic is only going to focus on one. It's only going to focus on the structure. We'll talk about the other part in a second. But again, keep taking a step back, zooming out a little bit more. Before we do that, we need to get clear on exactly what we mean by an argument, right? Your book talks about this, but I think it's worth emphasizing. An argument is not just verbal combat, right? When you hear the term argument, you might think, well, the idiots on some cable news show who are just insulting each other. You might think that couple in the restaurant who are both interested in making each other feel terrible that you don't want to look at. That is not what we mean by an argument in this class. Look, I'm not the language police. I'm not saying this is the only right way to use this term, but this is the specialized meaning of the term we're going to use in this class. And what we mean here is that an argument is a statement or series of statements, the premises, that give reason, if it's only one, or reasons if there's more than one, which there usually will be, to think that some other statement, the conclusion, is true. So let me just give you guys some very simple examples. Arguments in real life are never going to be, or almost never going to be this simple, but it's good to go with simple examples to get our head around, right? You guys might have played Clue when you were kids. Maybe you didn't. Where I grew up, the power went out a lot. Clue wasn't our favorite game. Monopoly was our favorite, but we did play a fair amount of Clue, right? In Clue, you're supposed to solve this murder. And so you say, well, Mrs. White, one of the suspects, or Colonel Mustard, killed Mr. Body, the guy who's dead in the game. Colonel Mustard didn't do it, so Miss White committed the murder, right? You have these statements. Either he or she did it, he didn't do it, so she did it, right? Conclusion is supposed to be she committed the murder, and these statements support it. Here's another one. It is not always wrong to lie. If it were always wrong to lie, then it would be wrong to lie to a murderer to save the innocent person he intends to kill. It is not wrong to lie to a murderer to save the innocent person he intends to kill. So it's not always wrong to lie, right? No. The universe either just happens to exist for no good reason, or there's a reason that explains its existence. So there must be a reason that explains its existence. Nothing just exists for no good reason. And now for all of these, you guys can think of, well, what's the conclusion? We'll talk about this more in a second. Usually in good writing, the conclusion will be at the beginning of the argument or the end, maybe in both places. The person will repeat. Not everything you're going to read in life is well written, right? This first one, well, what's our conclusion? Mrs. White committed the murder, right? In this second one, what's our conclusion? Stated right here to start with, it is not always wrong to lie, right? First one, it's the end. Second one, it's the beginning. This one, though, I deliberately wrote very badly. The universe either just happens to exist for no good reason, blah, 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 right? The conclusion is buried here, so there must be a reason that explains its existence. That is the conclusion. That is what these other statements are trying to show, right? Despite the final one, despite the fact that John is absolutely convinced he has Irumodic syndrome, this actually doesn't exist, I just stole it from Star Trek, but whatever. Despite the fact that John is convinced he has Irumodic syndrome, he almost certainly doesn't. For one thing, he has none of the risk factors. Most people who get the disease have a family history, and he doesn't. And John is in his 20s, and the disease almost never affects anyone less than 50 years old. Finally, we all know that John is a hypochondriac who is always convinced that he has whatever fatal disease he's just read about on the internet, right? What's the conclusion here? It's our first sentence. Despite the fact that John is absolutely convinced he has this disease, he doesn't, right? All these other statements give us reason to think that this first one is true. It is our conclusion. Just to review this, like I've had go through all the other slides, Mrs. White committed the murder. It is always wrong to lie. There must be a reason that explains its existence. And, despite the fact that John is convinced he has this, he doesn't, right? In all of these, this one statement, this conclusion, is the thing that these other statements, these other claims are trying to show is true, right? They're all supposed to give us reasons to accept it. Now, we'll talk a bit more about this, real life arguments, finding conclusions and such. Your book doesn't talk about this. I think it's something we should practice a little more. But, right now I just want to get on the table what an argument is and what part or what, feature of arguments logic is concerned with. So there's two things that makes an argument a good one. There's two bars that arguments need to clear if they're going to be convincing, if they're going to be any good. One is whether the premises are true or not. If the premises of your argument are false, then your argument doesn't really prove much of anything usually. There's some exceptions, maybe you're trying to think about what would be true if this other crazy thing were true, but generally speaking, an argument with false premises is pretty much useless, right? But an argument must also have the right structure. If the structure of your argument is not good, then even if your premises are true, they will not give us reason to think the conclusion is true. Good arguments must have premises that are true or very likely true, and they must have a good structure. It's like building a building, right? If you were going to build a house, you need a good plan for the building. You need to put the stuff together in the right way, or it's going to fall down. No matter how good your building materials are, if your blueprint's garbage, the house will fall down, right? But on the other side of the coin, even if you have a great plan for your house, if the builder uses shoddy materials, it's not going to stand up. It's not going to be a good house, right? Arguments are the same way. The premises have to fit together in the right way to support the conclusion, and they have to be true, right? Have to fit together the right way. The plan has to be good. The structure has to be good. They have to be true. That's our way of saying they have to be made out of good material, right? So let me give you some examples of arguments that fail. One or more of these, right? Here's an argument that actually has perfectly good structure. But it's not a good argument because the premises are not true. All dogs are at least as smart as any 5-year-old child. Schmuppers is a dog. The governor of Virginia is a 5-year-old child. Therefore, Schmuppers is at least as smart as the governor of Virginia, right? Right. we'll actually talk about this if, when we talk about validity and structure, we'll see that this argument actually has a perfectly fine structure, but the premises are crazy, right? Like, all dogs are at least as smart as a 5-year-old child? No, right? Most dogs are much dumber than most 5-year-old children, right? Schmuppers is a dog. I mean, look, you don't know whether this is true or not. You have no idea what Schmuppers is. I will just tell you Schmuppers is a friend of mine's cat. Schmuppers is not, in fact, a dog. This premise is also not true. The governor of Virginia is a 5-year-old child. Look, you know, this isn't true either. I don't know how old he is, but he's way older than 5. Therefore, our conclusion, Schmuppers is at least as smart as the governor of Virginia. Schmuppers is a perfectly smart cat. I don't think she's smarter than the governor. I think she's smarter than any adult. You know, these premises are just false. They're just crazy. They don't provide any support for our conclusion. Here's another one. Everyone who goes to Hamburger University and gets a degree in hamburgerology is a brilliant statesman. King Charles III went to Hamburger University and got his degree in hamburgerology. There is actually a Hamburger University. It's McDonald's University. They train people to be like McDonald's managers, right? Look, King Charles did not go there. Look, whatever, I'm not going to make too much fun of Hamburger University. I'm sure they teach you how to manage a McDonald's perfectly fine. Being a statesman, being a world leader, though, different skill set than managing the McDonald's, right? Crazy, stupid argument. It doesn't work. Let me give you some examples of arguments that go wrong in a different way, though. We can have true premises. The building materials are good, but they don't fit together in the right way, so it falls down, or if you want to speak in less metaphorical terms, it doesn't support the conclusion. The regular U.S. mail does not run on December 25th, and the regular U.S. mail does not run on Sunday, so December 25th must always be on a Sunday. Right. These premises don't actually support this conclusion because, well, all that it says is this is one day the mail doesn't run. Could well be that there's a lot of different days the mail doesn't run, a lot of different reasons it doesn't run, as there in fact are, right? When we say the mail doesn't run on December 25th, we don't mean that that's the only day it doesn't run on, so this argument doesn't work. Here's another one. If Jenna hires a professional to write her paper, she will get an A in English. She must have hired someone to write her paper because she got an A in English. Think for a second why this isn't a good argument, right? Like, Jenna doesn't exist, I just made her up. But let's suppose she did exist, and let's suppose it were true that if she hired someone to write her paper, she'd get an A. Why does this still not support this conclusion? She must have hired someone to write her paper because she got an A. Well, think about what this argument says, right? It's saying, well, one way she can get an A is to cheat to hire somebody to write her paper for her, but there might be lots of other ways she could get an A, right? If she works really, really hard on the paper, she might get an A, right? It might be that she's just really brilliant, really knows already how to write really well, and if she just works on it, puts even a middling amount of effort into it, she'll get an A, right? She could also cheat in other ways, right? She could guilt her mom into writing it for her. Then she wouldn't have hired somebody to write it, but maybe her mom would write a great paper, right? The argument says if she hires someone to write it, if she cheats, she will get an A. It doesn't say that that's the only way she could get an A, right? Premises do not support this conclusion. One more example. of an argument with, you know, maybe true premises and bad form. You know, when I worked in a factory in high school, I knew one poor guy who was really lazy. Therefore, the vast majority of poor people are really lazy. There's a guy who's a U.S. senator who actually wrote this in his memoir. This is not a good argument, right? You know, think about this. Think about an argument with a similar form. When I went to this museum in California once, I saw an alligator that was all white because it was an albino. I once saw a white alligator, so the vast majority, if not all, alligators are white, right? Seeing one example of something doesn't mean that most are like it, right? This argument, even if we accept the premises, the argument is not a good one. We'll end with an argument that actually is good, true premises, and a good form. We'll talk more about what a good form means, but opossums are marsupials, that is, animals that, raise their young in a pouch, and they live in North and South America, which they do. We have them here, right? So, not all marsupials live in Australia, right? These things are marsupials. They live in North and South America, so not all of them live in Australia. I know this is a boring, kind of weird argument, but, just trying to give you guys somewhat perhaps artificial and oversimplified examples just to hopefully make this clear, right? The important thing is, for an argument to be a good one, it has to have true premises and a good form. If it fails on either count, then you do not have a very good or very convincing argument. All right, well, so how do we decide this? How do we decide whether an argument has, a good form, right? That's what we're going to focus on in logic. True premises. I'm not an expert in animals or economics or any of the other stuff that arguments might talk about, physics, but I can talk about the form of arguments. Well, how are we going to decide whether arguments have a good form or they don't? We'll start talking about that next lecture, how we evaluate the form of an argument. To start that, we'll have to talk about there are two different kinds of arguments, deductive and inductive, and what the structure for each kind of argument, what a good structure looks like differs. We'll talk much more about deductive arguments. It's easier to come up with rules there, but we will say a little bit about the structure of inductive arguments. That might not make much sense yet. We'll have to distinguish, well, what exactly are inductive versus deductive arguments. We'll start to do that next lecture.